We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're tuned in to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. It's Saturday, March 7th, 2020. Thank you for tuning in to your local grassroots radio station. We have a very special show today. Not only are you joined by our normal co-hosts, Matt Treadwell and Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
But we have two special guests in the studio. First of which we have Robin Wilt. Robin, welcome back to Evidence of Design to you.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
It's our pleasure. You're a longtime progressive activist who has serves on the Brighton Town Council. You're also running for you're currently running for Congress to represent Rochester and Monroe County in the 25th Congressional District.
Yes.
And for the purposes of today's conversation, you are a pledged delegate for Bernie Sanders and will appear on the ballot in the April 28th presidential primary election.
Also correct.
We got it all down. And you're a realtor by profession, among, of course, many other hats.
Among many other hats, yes.
So welcome, Robin. And we're joined by first-time guest here, Nicholas Wilt. Thank you, yes. Nicholas, for being in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
You, same last name. You happen to be Robin's husband for 24 years.
Yes.
And you've been a professional software engineer for more than 30 years. You've worked at Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Amazon. And you're also running with Robin and 5 other folks as a pledged delegate for Bernie Sanders on, again, the April 28th presidential primary election ballot.
Yes, we're both longtime Sanders fans and supporters.
And that is exactly what we're going to talk about on today's show. We're going to be talking about Bernie Sanders' platform. We're going to if you're just tuning in to the politics now in the political season, tuning into what Sanders' platform stands for, why both of you support Bernie Sanders, and also perhaps investigating and even perhaps dispelling a lot of the fears or myths of Sanders' electability. So we will get into a lot this hour, and we invite you listeners to give us a call, again, live radio on Saturday, March 7th. There's a number of ways you can participate. First and foremost is by giving us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at Radio EOD, and you can email us at radioeod@gmail.com throughout the hour. But let's waste no more time and get right into the discussion. So this question is for either of you, Robin or Nicholas. Both of you are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders. What, in a nutshell, does that mean that you'll appear on the ballot for on April 28th?
So, in addition to the presidential primary, there is also a primary occurring for the delegates, the representatives that will go and cast ballots at the Democratic National Convention, and this year it's in Milwaukee. And so we will, it's for each congressional district in this state, there are pledged delegates for the presidential candidates. So Biden has a certain number of delegates, and Sanders has a certain number of delegates. In the 25th Congressional District, it is 7 delegates, 4 women and 3 men. We have a very diverse slate of delegates that we're very proud of on the Sanders slate, and we will basically take the vote to the people, and they will not only select somebody as their designated candidate, the nominee for the state of New York, but also they will select the delegates to go cast ballots in favor of that nominee.
Now, there were a lot of candidates running on the Democratic ticket for throughout this presidential primary, and both of you are longtime Bernie Sanders supporters. Why, out of all the candidates running for president, do you support Sanders and his platform?
For so many reasons. I've been a long-time advocate for single-payer health care, Medicare for all, because I think that nobody should be left out and that health care is a human right. So we formed an organization, local organization that was an affiliate of a national organization called Progressive Democrats of America. So our local chapter was Progressive Democrats of Genesee Valley. And in the course of that organizing, their slogan was healthcare, not warfare. So they wanted to basically have different priorities for our budget. They wanted to prioritize social programs over endless war, over the prison industrial complex, over a lot of the things that we see as a result of the corporate influence over our politics. And so in the course of that organizing, they were the organization that recruited Sanders to run in 2016. So we had arranged a number of different events throughout Monroe County over the course of our organizing for Progressive Democrats of America, one of which was a healthcare town hall. This was prior to the ACA having been passed, that garnered, attendance of 500 people. So we, through that organizing, realized that there was a yearning to decommoditize healthcare, make sure that it is a human right. And Bernie Sanders was one of the earlier elected officials that was on that bandwagon. So he was a natural choice to recruit to run on this progressive platform.
For our family in particular, the healthcare not warfare frame struck close to home because Robin's brother is a 2002 graduate of West Point and deployed to Iraq in 2004 and suffered a grievous injury that eventually resulted in the amputation of his left leg. So for us, a vote for or against the Iraq war is a meaningful litmus test, and the stakes have gone up in a way for us because our eldest son is now a junior at West Point, and the administration will straight-facedly, when they're presenting to the parents, thank us for sharing their children with them to serve as combat leaders in the global war on terror. And he was 2 years old on 9/11. Mm-hmm. And the war in Iraq was characterized by Richard Clark, the counterterrorism lead who held over into the Bush administration from the Clinton administration. He characterized the invasion of Iraq post 9/11 he likened it to invading Mexico. Mm-hmm. There was an awareness at the highest levels of leadership of this country that was not a wise course of action. And Bernie opposed that war, and he has consistently opposed military intervention. It is not difficult to reconcile respect for the troops with opposition to war. There are thousands of veterans committing suicide every year, and I think part of the reason for that is because we haven't engaged in what you would call a just war since the 1940s. And if we're asking our young people to put their lives on the line in service to this country, I think they need to be completely bought in that what they're doing is going to advance the strategic interests of the nation. And they are, Bernie Sanders is actually leading all the entire presidential field in donations from active duty military. And yes. I think part of the reason is because they also recognize that you can reconcile support for the troops with opposition to war.
Yeah, I think ultimately we need to treat our troops as a valuable resource that they are, and that means not going into conflicts that are unwarranted.
And so, of course, Bernie Sanders' platform is many and diverse, and both of you are citing, a sort of a history of supporting what you named as progressive platforms and policies.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask what progressivism means to you, and I don't mean to do this as sort of just a fun academic wax philosophical discussion, but really like progressivism can mean a lot of different things to different people, and I think that it's a very important part of Sanders' platform and getting people to understand what sort of progressivism is. Because I think that when I at least have a lot of conversations with voters is that folks support things that are progressive, but they would never think of it as progressive. Is there something else that progressivism means to you, or why you would support sort of a progressive platform as you'd like to define it?
Yeah, and I think these days we hear a lot about litmus tests. And I think in a way that is an attempt to obfuscate and try to say that your value system isn't necessarily what you should prioritize in terms of your voting. And AOC said it best when she said that, we can't just say that everybody is a progressive if they don't believe the same things that we believe. And that's not being exclusive. What it is just hewing to your values. And so to me, progressivism is just that. It means making progress. It doesn't involve perpetuation of the status quo. FDR, for instance, had a very radical progressive platform. We've seen progressive platforms before with Teddy Roosevelt. We want real change. We want substantive change. We don't want to do things the way that we've done before. So is it progressive to run on the ACA, which is already a status quo policy, or is it progressive to want to improve on the ACA? And so I guess that is the difference for me, wanting to move forward, wanting to evolve on what we currently have. And so that's the bright line for me. And it's not being exclusive, it is just being explicit.
So I'll build on that by saying a couple things. AOC, in a recent New York Magazine interview, more or less complained that there is no admissions test to become a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the CPC, of which Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna, I believe, are the co-chairs.
Yes.
There is, unlike many other caucuses within the House of Representatives, you can just self-identify as a progressive and you're in. And so that has resulted in a dilution of the meaning of the term. And if you're curious about where the terminology is really rooted, when people try to say that, when they try to appropriate the term, I reference the Progressive Party platform of 1912, which is an extraordinary document to read. It starts out by saying, and this will sound familiar to anyone who's unsatisfied with contemporary politics, it says, both parties have subordinated themselves to corporate interests, and we need to do something about this. And it lays out a whole bunch of policy objectives, some of which we are still working to enact today.
Yeah.
Now, some of them have been enacted. For example, it may not be widely known that, U.S. senators did not used to be elected by popular vote. They used to be sent to the Senate by the legislatures of their respective states. And so that was one of the policy objectives outlined in this platform that got enacted less than a decade later. Other things like a national health care system is alluded to, and even things that look a bit odd viewed through a modern lens, like mineral rights. They have a section that reads a bit oddly if you're an environmentalist, because it says, the minerals on public lands belong to the people. But even today, we have a federal government that leases mineral rights to corporations and sells them at way below market value. So I would say that the majority of the policy objectives outlined in that document have not yet been fully attained. We've made some progress here and there, but progressives still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and there's a lot in the progressive platform that talks about corporate interests versus the interests of the people. And so when I talk about progressivism, I'm talking about prioritizing the interests of the people over corporate interests. Very simply that.
Mm-hmm. People power.
Yes.
Well, let me reintroduce the both of you here. Listeners, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. And we're talking about Bernie Sanders' platform today and perhaps dispelling fears or myths about his electability. We're joined by two special guests. The person you just heard was Robin Wilt, who's a longtime progressive activist and serves on the Brighton Town Council. Robin's also currently running for Congress to represent Rochester and Monroe County in the 25th Congressional District. We're also joined by Nicholas Wilt, who's been the husband, of course, of Robin Wilt for 24 years. I love that's the first part in the title, the bio. That's very important. And who's been a professional software engineer for more than 30 years. And both Robin and Nicholas are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders to appear on the April 28th presidential primary election ballot. I should also remind you that you are able to participate with us in a number of different ways. You can give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, 585-219-8889. Or communicate with us at handle Radio EOD through email, Facebook, or Twitter. A lot has changed in the election, the presidential primary election on the Democratic side in the past 2 weeks. It was a very different conversation 2 weeks ago. A number of the things that have changed is that now we're down to three candidates essentially running. There's Bernie Sanders, there's Joe Biden, and Tulsi Gabbard. Pete Buttigieg dropped out, endorsed Joe Biden. Amy Klobuchar dropped out, endorsed Joe Biden. Beto O'Rourke was already dropped out, endorsed Joe Biden. And there's really been a strong consolidation on behalf of Biden from the Democratic Party establishment. And so I think it's safe to say that, this past week, Super Tuesday was more disappointing for Sanders than many of his supporters thought it would be, although that, of course, is up for debate, given the anticipated reaction against the Democratic Party establishment against Joe Biden. But there's a lot of voters out there, Democratic voters at least, who want nothing more than to see Donald Trump lose in November.
That's correct.
And I think that a lot of those voters might say that they would vote for Biden over Sanders because they see Biden as being more so-called electable. What would the both of you as Sanders supporters have to say to voters when it comes to electability?
Well, I think we really have to think carefully about who is advancing that narrative. And party insiders were wrong about the electability of Obama. They were wrong about Trump. And their conventional wisdom is currently contradicted by the actual voter data when it comes to Sanders. For 5 years, the polls have demonstrated that Sanders beats Trump in a head-to-head matchup. And right now, he is the only Democratic candidate that beats Trump in a head-to-head matchup in the polling. And just this month, a recent Emerson poll demonstrated that Sanders was the only candidate to beat Trump in a head-to-head matchup, and that the turnout down ballot is not affected by a Sanders leading the ticket as opposed to Biden leading a ticket. So I think a lot of the Democratic establishment is very concerned about down ballot races and the coattails of Sanders, but the polling actually demonstrates otherwise. Regardless who is at the top of the ticket, down ballot races are going to be voted in. But I think that what they fail to take into account is just the popular support for Bernie Sanders. I think you'd have to be blind and deaf and not paying attention to the current situation if you didn't realize that Sanders is drawing the largest crowds of any candidate by far. He's breaking records. There was crowds of 17,000 in Tacoma, 27,000 just here in New York State, at Queensbridge Park. In LA, the East LA rally, how many people was that? Again, it was a record-breaking crowd, almost 30,000 people. And so I question when you have a candidate who can barely fill a high school auditorium facing a candidate who draws crowds of tens of thousands, and you're saying that the one who can't fill a high school auditorium is the one that is more electable.
Well, I will say also that ousting Trump is, necessary but not sufficient, as a mathematician might say. We none of us are comfortable with Donald Trump as president, but the system, we have to consider whether Trump is a symptom or a cause, or the effect of the system. And I would argue that systematic undermining of our democracy and having two parties that are friendly to corporate interests is what has facilitated Donald Trump becoming president. So, and many of the people who tell me that ousting Trump is their top priority, I sort of look at them superficially, and they don't look to me like people who are that legitimately concerned. As a visible family, as someone who married into a first-generation American family, an Afro-Caribbean family, we have biracial children. Trump represents an existential threat to us. And many of the people who say to me that they consider Trump this huge threat, and yet they're open to Biden being the nominee, I'm not sure they're weighing the full context of what they're saying, because a return to 12, 15 years ago, I think should not be an articulated goal for the American people. Medicare for all, if you look at the platform, 77% of Democrats favor Medicare for all. And one of the interesting outcomes of Super Tuesday is that a majority of Democratic voters coming out of Super Tuesday said that they favored Medicare for all, even in states where Joe Biden performed better. And that interests me. It shows sort of a messaging deficit perhaps on the part of Sanders, because we really only have one presidential candidate who can credibly claim to be full-throatedly supporting that policy.
Yeah, had Medicare for all been on the ballot, I think we would have seen a different result, because Sanders is the only one supporting Medicare for all, and that single issue won overwhelmingly on Tuesday.
Well, Nicholas, you kind of answered my next question, but I'd like us to maybe expand on this a little bit more, because I think it's very central to the campaign that we're seeing right now, and that a central tenet of Sanders' platform is to build a mass movement of people to create what he would describe as a political revolution. That's very different and contrasts directly with the platforms of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, both of whom campaign on returning America to some notion of the way things used to be, or in older halcyon days. I know you mentioned a little bit, Nicholas, but why do you think, or either Nicholas or Robin, why do you think that a political revolution is what's required in our politics? Why is that essential?
Well, I think the circumstances that we see today, the massive wealth inequality, the endless war, the climate crisis, those are situations that evolve from our current policies. they didn't just come out of nowhere. They are an expression of the policies that we have been championed over the last several decades. And so when we talk about going back to the status quo, returning to the status quo where we don't have a despot in the White House, that's not sufficient to undo all of the ills that were wrought over decades of exclusionary policy. And so that is why we're supporting a candidate who is talking about not just, defeating Donald Trump, but actually has a vision for the future that includes all of us, and actually goes back and fixes it's reparative and restorative in terms of some of the policies that have resulted in mass incarceration, that have resulted in the climate crisis, that have resulted in endless wars, and those policies basically have favored corporate interests. And so again, if we prioritize the needs of the people, we will see different outcomes. And we need to do that through our policy.
There is one substantive difference between 4 years ago and the present insofar as our local set of pledged delegates, which is that 2 of the 7 pledged delegates are current elected officials.
Yeah.
Robin is an elected official in Brighton, and Mary Lupien, of course, was recently elected to city council in the city of Rochester, and she had run as a pledged delegate 4 years ago. And that, to me, is evidence that the articulated strategy of building a movement is working.
Yeah.
Sanders has been advocating for Medicare for all. It would be hard to find a different explanation than Sanders' candidacy for putting it front and center and getting 77% of Democrats on board with that policy. So we have a message, and, we have a standard bearer. We are fully aware of his age and his identity as a white male.
White male, yes.
Well, but if you focus on the policy, it really speaks to people, and it is resonating, and I think it's a winning message. As far as electability this fall, we also look back at 2016 and say, look, Hillary Clinton won 65 million votes, and Donald Trump only got 62 million. That's 127 million votes total cast. 100 million people did not vote in 2016. So we should be asking ourselves, who is going to engender support and excitement and get people to vote, those 100 million people to vote and make their voices heard?
Yeah, I don't think that we can deny that the enthusiasm gap is real. Mm-hmm. And I think the current machinations of the Democratic Party are extremely dangerous, because Sanders has absolutely engendered support among a new electorate, people who have not voted in previous elections. And the Democratic Party risks losing a whole generation of newly enthusiastic and engaged voters if they manipulate the situation so that Sanders does not get the nomination in the event that he is the top delegate winner.
And to be fair, there is evidence they've done that in 2016. W. Wasserman Schultz, the then chair of the DNC, the infamous WikiLeaks leaks and so on and so forth, showed that the DNC had at least active bias against Bernie Sanders then, if not manipulation in favor of Hillary Clinton. So there is warrant to that argument.
Yeah, Donna Brazile in her book has reflected on that, and definitely Debbie Wasserman Schultz has come out and said that they weren't obligated to adhere to their own rules, and they're a private institution and they can flout their own rules. And
they made that argument in court.
Yes, and they made that argument in court, and Donna Brazile has similarly presented evidence in her recent book that yes, the process was manipulated to disfavor Senator Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
There is a $15 billion industry in what I call the political industrial complex.
Yes.
Which is, this, again, it's facilitated by corporate money, and it's actually astonishing to me what a great return donations to political candidates delivers. There was an economic study a couple of years ago that showed a 22,000% return. A Detroit City Councilwoman was convicted for steering $1 billion waste management contract in exchange for $6,000 in cash. And that type of amplification, so not only is it problematic, but it's a very good investment for corporations to give money to these, not just the candidates. The candidates have consultants. It's not uncommon for congressional candidates to be spending $5,000 a month on fundraising consultants and $2,500 a month on compliance consultants, and those consulting firms all have employees, and they're all very happy with the status quo, and I honestly am not sure if they are as concerned about Donald Trump as they say. It may be that they're not afraid Sanders would lose to Trump. They're afraid Sanders would beat him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think losing control is really at the centerpiece of the behavior of the two major parties. The progressive wing has not been welcomed with open arms into the so-called big tent. We're seeing local pushback. We're seeing pushback at every jurisdictional level. Right now we are in the petition gathering phase, which again, this is just one of those obstacles to participatory democracy that people do not even realize exists. Even to sit on your Democratic committee, you can't just be there by dint of wanting to be engaged. Every 2 years, the entire party membership is put up to ballot. Essentially, we are walking our petitions not just to be a member of Congress or sitting on the town board or sitting in state government. We're also walking petitions to be members of our local Democratic committee. And I don't think people realize how many barriers are in place to participating in our government.
Well, let me reintroduce the both of you here. If you're just joining us, you are hearing both Robin Wilt and Nicholas Wilt, both of whom are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders on the April 28th presidential primary election in New York State. And we're talking this hour about Bernie Sanders' platform and perhaps dispelling some of the myths or fears about his electability. You're tuned into 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, and you're listening to Evidence of Design. I should remind you that you're able to participate in this conversation. You can give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. This is live radio on Saturday, March 7th, 2020. Don't be shy, 585-219-8889. Robin, we were just talking about some of the perhaps friction between the Democratic Party establishment and perhaps a more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think we see that locally in Monroe County, and you brought up a little bit about that as well. Several high-profile Democratic leaders in Monroe County have endorsed other Democrats for president. This includes our mayor, Lovely Warren. It includes the chair of the local DNC, Brittany Wells. It includes Jamie Romeo, now the county clerk. And it includes Alex Udelson, the chief of staff for the mayor. You both are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders. You're both organizers for an organization called Monroe County for Bernie Sanders. What is your sense of Sanders' favorability in Monroe County or progressivism writ large in Monroe County?
Well, again, I think you said it, our establishment Democrats are supporting establishment candidates. And the candidates that offer solutions for people, the candidates that really are talking about the issues that excite the electorate are not necessarily those that are being supported by the Democratic establishment. And I think going into this election season, one of the things that I wanted to see was mobilization of disaffected, disenfranchised, and disillusioned members of the electorate. I think that for very long, the two parties have been talking about the same things, and those things that they've been talking about have not been engaging our electorate because they don't reflect the issues that are impacting people on an everyday basis. People not having access to health care is a huge barrier to participation in our democracy. People not having access to housing or food or any of the basic necessities are barriers to participation. And I don't think that most of the candidates are talking about those very basic necessities of the electorate not being met. And so that's why I think we see a difference between people who are running from the progressive side, who are actually out there talking to people every day, and those on the establishment side who are essentially running a machine. They are stewards of a process that by definition is exclusionary. So they are not getting the pulse of the electorate.
So just a quick correction, because you referenced Jamie Romeo being our county clerk. She is the candidate, the designated candidate for county clerk.
Well, she's been appointed at this point.
Right. Oh, fair. But she was a one-term assembly member, and just watching the sort of seats opening and then the jumping from one seat to the next says everything we need to know about what people mean when they say the Democratic establishment. The good news is that I believe all of the candidates are opposed,
yes.
And they know the rules. They need to petition themselves onto the ballot. It is petitioning time, and the people will decide at election time who's going to represent them in the different jurisdictions that are being contested.
Yeah, so I would encourage people to really vote their values. Don't vote based on electability, because that is a myth. It's a myth perpetuated by the establishment in order to maintain control. Very simply, the power does reside with the people. But the people have to exercise that power. And so I would encourage people to become involved, really vote your values, and look out for those candidates who are talking about issues that resonate with you.
Well, let's turn to the phones now. We have a caller, and you should be on the air on 100.9 FM WXIR. Hello, are you there?
Yes, hi, this is Jeff from Webster.
Hey, Jeff from Webster, what's on your mind?
I certainly wish good luck to your speakers who are on the show today. They sound very thoughtful. I did want to point out some things, though. In 2016, Bernie Sanders won 60% of the vote in New Hampshire in the Democratic primary. In the year 2020, just a few weeks ago, Sanders won only 25% of the vote in New Hampshire in the Democratic primary. So his percentage of the vote in New Hampshire went from 60% down to 25%. So I don't see a groundswell of support for Sanders. And then also, if you look at the numbers for Virginia, which just had its primary, the numbers of the voters in the Virginia Democratic primary from 2016 to 2020 doubled in number. And of course, Joe Biden won that decisively against Sanders by winning over 50% of the vote in Virginia. So there's no groundswell of support for Sanders in Virginia. Instead, it was for all the late-breaking votes that went for Biden. And my last comment is, the two speakers you have there, they are delegates that are pledged to Sanders, but would they, if Biden becomes the nominee for the Democratic Party, would they pledge to support Biden if Biden becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party? Thank you.
Okay, I'm very glad that this question was asked, because we saw a lot of this in the news coverage on Super Tuesday, basically comparing 2016 vote totals to 2020 vote totals. And these are apples and oranges. we had a very crowded electoral field in 2020. In 2016, we had a head-to-head matchup. So I find it difficult to try to reconcile, those two very different scenarios. When we're talking about percentage of the vote, if you're presented with 5 options as opposed to just 2 options, each of the 2 options are going to gain a much larger percentage of the vote if you're limited to those 2 options. But if you're presented with 5 options, you will see that the vote will then decrease among all of the options available. So I hesitate to use that as any sort of a metric for how much of a groundswell each of these candidates has. And then what was the second question in terms of pledged
would
delegates?
you, should Biden win the nomination, would you support Biden? I think Jeff Webster was talking about with your vote in November.
I don't think that's a fair question for a pledged delegate, because obviously we are doing everything in our power. Well,
we've been hearing this for
exactly.
a long
Vote blue,
time.
no matter who.
And what's funny is very recently, now that we do have a 2-person candidacy, we have Biden surrogates publicly declaiming that they will not support Sanders in November if he becomes the nominee, which is a real 180 from a few weeks ago and the months preceding, when they were demanding what I call the blue loyalty pledge. We've all seen it on Twitter and Facebook. Vote blue no matter who. All we want is Trump out. And it's really what it is a perpetuation of a myth about Sanders supporters that dates back to 2016,
right,
when it was claimed disingenuously that we lost the election because Sanders supporters voted for Trump. That has been studied, and the percentage of Sanders Trump supporters was about half that. The incidence was about half that of Clinton supporters who then cast a vote for McCain in 2008, for example. So, there's many potential explanations and probably some combination that explain why we lost in 2016. But I consider the blue loyalty pledge to be, it's kind of like asking me when I stopped beating my wife, right? Yeah. It's just, there's an assumption built into the question that is not fair.
And that assumption is that Sanders loyalists are not loyalists to the party. And I would agree that Sanders loyalists are loyalists to their values. And I would say that everybody working right now to get Sanders elected is focused on that. They're not focused on losing the Democratic nomination. We are focused on organizing so that Sanders wins that nomination. And, so it's very hard to consider a scenario where Sanders does not win that nomination. And so I'm not even going to address it, because literally I am doing everything possible to make sure that Sanders wins that nomination. We are organizing every day. And so I'm not even going to consider him not winning that nomination at this point.
I probably shouldn't jump in as host, but I think a great counter argument to the idea that we need to be loyal to our party or something like that is that the Republican Party has essentially become Trump's party because of party loyalty, and that's of course debatable, but I think there's a lot there where it's like, do we really want party loyalty? But I do think we have another caller on the phone. Hello, you are on the air. This is 100.9 FM WXIR, Evidence of Design. What's on your mind?
Hi, this is Aaron from Queens. I'm just calling because the previous caller, Jeff, pointed out something interesting, which I think is enlightening about the turnout in Virginia specifically. Yes, there was a huge increase in turnout, and yes, it was generally in favor of Joe Biden, and I think that's funny that he used Virginia as an example, because I don't think there's single state in the country more emblematic of establishment politics than Virginia. You have tons of people who live and work in Washington, D.C., for think tanks, for the government itself, for, various party apparatuses and stuff like that. And those are exactly the kind of people who this movement is, targeted at, from Bernie supporters like myself who, I believe, have been responsible for the failure of Democratic Party politics, why we control almost no levers of power anymore. People thinking inside these very old boxes, and basically people just trying to preserve their hegemony and people trying to preserve their existing ways of life at the cost of any progress and improvement for the working class. So I think Virginia is actually a really good example of why Bernie's politics are important and why they're succeeding in other parts of the country, and why I've gotten, so much popular movement behind them, specifically not in Virginia. Thank you.
That's a very good point. I mean, Terry McAuliffe was literally sitting on one of the panels for, I think it was CNN that night, and I thought that was so disingenuous. He's literally worked on
former governor,
and he's worked on. He was a Clinton staffer, and to have somebody sitting on a panel that is supposedly impartial and just examining the returns and the results of the election, when he's sitting there spinning it. I think that is a type of disingenuous behavior that we see from the establishment that has got people disaffected.
Well, one final reintroduction for our hour. If you're just tuning in, we are talking with Robin Wilt and Nicholas Wilt, both of whom are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders on the April 28th presidential primary election here in New York State. Robin Wilt currently serves on the Brighton Town Council and is also currently running for Congress to represent Rochester and Monroe County in the 25th Congressional District. And Nicholas Wilt, among many other things, also happens to be Robin's husband. It's hard to go second, Nicholas, I'm sorry.
Sometimes I say I'm her chauffeur.
Campaign janitor, so many roles.
You can join our conversation by giving us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. We're talking about Bernie Sanders' platform and perhaps trying to dispel some of the myths or fears of his so-called electability. I think a central question to that for voters is that many voters perhaps are wary of the socialism word that is oftentimes attached to Bernie Sanders' name. He is a self-described democratic socialist, and as we define progressivism at the start of the hour, that has many meanings and connotations. To you, what does democratic socialism mean, and what would you say to voters who are scared of that S word, as it could be called?
Well, again, I think that S word has been used to describe so many things across a very broad spectrum. And we often forget the D word that precedes it.
Which is democratic.
Yes, democratic.
Yes.
So democratic socialist is basically somebody who prioritizes the needs of the people, would like to see a disintermediation of corporate influence on our policy and on our government. So I think that many of the values that and the issues that Sanders stands for, like the opposing money, corporate money's control of our elections, and most Americans would agree that they want that. Single-payer health care, we know that 77% of Democrats want that. Most Americans oppose our interventionist foreign policy, and that is, again, among the Democratic Socialist platform, because, again, it is removing the corporate influence over our system and prioritizing people in those institutions. So that's simply what it is. And when you go down the entire platform, most people agree with the platform.
We have socialism. It's pervasive. Yes. Social Security and Medicare are socialist programs. And Bernie does a pretty good job of talking about how corporations utilize government to mitigate their risks and amplify their profits. It's just, you can just see it in the healthcare system. Consider who is eligible for government-sponsored healthcare: active duty military, veterans. The poor are eligible for Medicaid. The elderly are eligible for Medicare. If you're on Social Security disability for 2 years, you become Medicare eligible. And this is interesting. If you suffer from kidney failure and need dialysis, you become immediately Medicare eligible. So what do those patient bases have in common? They all need, different levels of care, higher levels of care.
They are the highest risk populations.
And when Obamacare was enacted, one of the provisions in there that people often frame as positive is that adult children up to age 26 get to stay on their parents' plans. Well, they don't even need child visits. That's an extremely inexpensive patient base to cover. So what's happened in the wake of Obamacare is that the most profitable patient bases get left to corporations to profit from, and the most expensive ones get visited on the government. So one frame for Medicare for All is that it drives down the per capita cost of delivering health care because it allows the government to cover healthy people as well as people who need more care. And if you view it through that lens, there are many, many, many different policies that have a similar posture, and a lot of the policies are written by lobbyists. Congress members spend so much time on the phone fundraising that they have trouble, and AOC has been very public about this, that the grassroots fundraising that she has enables her to actually do her job. For those who cannot do their job, they have corporate lobbyists to do it for them, and we are all suffering from the policy that comes out of that process.
Absolutely. Well said.
Both of you are organizers for an organization called Monroe County for Bernie Sanders. Is there an event going on later today that folks could be tuned into?
There is, and I'll let Nick take that.
Right. So in the wake of Super Tuesday, a lot of Sanders supporters were disheartened. So we created an event called something like Don't Get Angry, Get Involved. And it's going to be hosted at Robin's new office at 1100 University Avenue at 1 p.m. today. We're going to be talking about ways to parlay your frustration, as it were, into constructive action, because 2/3 of the delegates in the presidential primary have yet to be decided. And New York is the second largest state that hasn't voted yet. So we have an opportunity to make a real difference here.
Absolutely. And I would emphasize that power concedes nothing without a demand. So anybody who thought that this was going to be easy, that this movement, this revolution was going to be televised, I would encourage you to rethink that and get engaged right now. We are really at a critical moment where we can decide whether we're going to have a government that is beholden to the people, or we're going to continue to have a government that is beholden to plutocrats and corporate interests.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up there for this hour. Thank you for tuning in to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This was Evidence of Design, and we were joined by both Robin Wilt and Nicholas Wilt in studio. Robin Wilt is a longtime progressive activist who serves on the Brighton Town Council, and she is currently running for Congress to represent Rochester and Monroe County in the 25th Congressional District. And Nicholas Wilt is Robin's husband and has been a professional software engineer for more than 30 years. He's worked at such corporations as Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Amazon. And both Robin and Nicholas are running as pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders in the April 28th presidential primary election. Robin, where can people learn more about your campaign for Congress?
You can find more about my platform at www.wilt, WILTFOR, for Congress.com.
Thank you both so much for joining us on Evidence of Design.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I was your host, Jason Taylor, joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell and Mary Lawrence.
Thank you.
We'll be live. Well, we won't be live for you next Saturday, but you'll hear something from us next Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. on WXIR. Stay tuned for the Esquire Hour. They're up next, and they put on a pretty great show. Thanks for being here. Be well, stay informed, stay involved, and bye-bye.